All right, so are you ready to dive into something kind of crazy?
Always.
Okay, good. Because today we're looking at presidential firing power.
Ooh, that's a juicy one.
Yeah, it is. And we got to start with this story about a guy named Hampton Dellinger.
Okay, so Hampton Dellinger, he was the special counsel in charge of whistleblower complaints.
Right, and he got fired.
He did, and this is why we're talking about it, because it brings up this whole question of presidential power.
Yeah, and specifically this old Supreme Court case, what was it called?
Humphrey's Executor, back in 1935.
Humphrey's Executor. Okay, I vaguely remember this one. It had something to do with President Roosevelt, didn't it?
You got it. It all started when Roosevelt wanted to get rid of a guy on the Federal Trade Commission. This guy was from the previous administration, so a Hoover appointee.
A holdover.
Right, a holdover, and Roosevelt just wanted his own people in there.
So he fired him.
Exactly. But the thing is, Congress had put some rules in place about these kinds of positions.
To, protect them from being fired without a good reason.
Exactly. They wanted to make sure these agencies could stay independent.
So what happened? Did Roosevelt get away with it?
Nope. The Supreme Court said, nope. Congress can create rules to protect certain positions, and the president can't just ignore those rules.
Okay, so that's Humphrey's Executor in a nutshell. But how does it relate to Dellinger getting fired almost a century later?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Dellinger's firing is basically testing the limits of Humphrey's Executor.
So we could be talking about a major Supreme Court showdown over whether the president has more power to fire people.
Potentially, yeah. And to make things even spicier, there are a couple of Supreme Court justices who have already said they think Humphrey's Executor should be overturned completely.
Whoa. Okay, so if that happened, if Humphrey's Executor goes out the window, what does that mean for all these other independent agencies?
Well, that's what we're going to try to figure out today. It could have huge implications for agencies like the FTC, the EPA, the SEC, you name it.
So basically, the whole structure of the government could be up for grabs.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. It all boils down to this tug of war between presidential power and the independence of these agencies.
Right. So on the one hand, you have the president who's supposed to be in charge of the executive branch.
And on the other hand, you have these agencies that are supposed to be impartial and make decisions based on expertise, not politics.
So it's a classic debate about how we balance those two things.
Exactly. And in this case, the stakes are incredibly high.
Okay, so I'm starting to see why this is such a big deal, but let's get into the specifics here. What exactly is the administration's argument for why they should be able to fire people like Dellinger?
Well, they're basically saying that the president needs to be able to control the executive branch. And if they can't fire people who disagree with their policies, it undermines their ability to carry out the will of the people.
I see, but couldn't you argue that giving the president that much power would be dangerous? I mean, we're talking about positions that are supposed to be impartial, like the head of the FTC, who's supposed to be protecting consumers.
Right? That's the whole point of having these independent agencies. They're supposed to be free from political pressure so they can make decisions based on what's best for the country, not what's best for the president or their party.
So you're saying this isn't just about Dellinger's job. This is about whether a whole bunch of agencies could lose their independence.
It is. And it's not just some obscure agencies either. We're talking about agencies that affect everyone's lives, the Federal Reserve, the SEC, you name it.
Okay, now I'm really starting to get why this is so important. We're talking about the potential for political influence over some of the most important functions of our government.
And that's why this whole situation is so fascinating and a little bit terrifying. It raises some fundamental questions about how our government works and who really has the power.
All right. Okay, so I'm officially hooked. Let's dive even deeper into this. What are some specific cases where we're seeing this battle play out right now?
Well, there's the case of Gwen Wilcox, who was fired as the chair of the National Labor Relations Board.
So the National Labor Relations Board, or NLRB, for those who don't spend all day thinking about this stuff,
Right.
they handle disputes between workers and employers.
Exactly. So if you've ever been in a union or had a workplace issue, you might have run into the NLRB.
Okay, so Gwen Wilcox, she was the chair of the NLRB, and she got fired.
Yep, and she didn't go quietly.
Oh, really?
She's filed a lawsuit challenging the firing, saying it violated those for-cause removal protections.
Oh, so basically she's saying Congress put those protections in place for a reason, and the president can't just ignore them.
Exactly. And her case could have huge implications for other independent agencies.
Because it could set a precedent.
Exactly. If the Supreme Court sides with the administration and says it's okay to fire Wilcox without cause, It opens the door for them to do the same thing with other agencies.
Like the EPA or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
Potentially, yeah, it's
Yeah.
like a domino effect.
Okay, so we're talking about way more than just one person's job here. We're
Yeah,
talking about the potential for a major power shift in the government.
right. And the Justice Department is really pushing the envelope on this.
How so?
Well, they've sent a letter to the Senate saying they're going to challenge the constitutionality of these protections for certain agencies.
Whoa, hold on. So they're actually trying to make it easier for the president to fire people from these agencies?
It seems that way, yeah. They've even named some specific agencies they're targeting.
Like which ones?
Well, the Federal Trade Commission is one.
So no more independent consumer protection watchdog.
Potentially not if they get their way. They're also targeting the National Labor Relations Board, which we just talked about, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission.
So basically no more independent watchdogs,
You know.
period.
That seems to be the direction they're heading in. And some senators, like Senator Durbin, are pushing back hard.
Is saying what?
Durbin's calling it a power grab and a blatant attempt to politicize independent agencies.
So we've got the administration pushing for more presidential power. You've got some senators pushing back. And you've got all these legal cases that could end up reshaping the balance of power in our government.
It's definitely a story to keep your eye on.
Okay, but let's take a step back for a second and look at the big picture. What are the arguments for and against overturning Humphrey's executor? I mean, why is this such a hot-button issue?
Well, on the one hand, you have people who say that the president should have more control over the executive branch. They argue that if the president is elected by the people, they should have the power to fire anyone who isn't carrying out their agenda.
So basically they're saying more presidential power equals more democracy.
That's the gist of it, yeah. They say it makes the government more efficient and responsive to the will of the voters.
But what about the other side? What are the arguments for keeping these agencies independent?
Well, the main argument is that these agencies were designed to be independent for a reason. They deal with complex issues that require expertise. And they're supposed to make decisions based on what's best for the country, not what's politically expedient.
So, like, the head of the EPA shouldn't be making decisions about environmental regulations based on what will get the president reelected.
Right. They should be making decisions based on science, data, and the long-term health of the environment.
Okay, I can see that. But let's play devil's advocate for a minute. Couldn't you argue that some of these agencies have gotten too big and too powerful? I mean, they're not elected by anyone.
Yeah, that's definitely a critique you hear from people who want a smaller, less powerful government. They say these independent agencies are too bureaucratic and unaccountable to the people.
So in their view, giving the president more power to hire and fire the heads of these agencies would be a way to make them more accountable.
That's the thinking. It's about restoring a balance of power.
Okay, so there are valid arguments on both sides. But at the end of the day, why should the average person care about this? How could this potentially affect their lives?
Well, let me give you an example. Imagine you're a parent, and you're concerned about the safety of the toys your kids are playing with. The Consumer Product Safety Commission is the agency that's supposed to make sure those toys are safe.
Right.
But if the president can easily fire the head of the CPSC and replace them with someone who's more friendly to the toy industry, it could mean weaker safety regulations and potentially more dangerous toys on the market.
Wow, okay, that's close to home. Suddenly, this legal battle feels a lot more real.
It is real. And it's not just about toys. It's about clean air and water. It's about safe food and drugs. It's about a stable financial system. All of these things are affected by the decisions of these independent agencies.
So the stakes are pretty high.
They are. And that's why it's so important to understand what's at stake here. This isn't just some abstract legal debate. It's about the kind of country we want to live in.
Okay, I'm convinced. This is a big deal. But what happens next? I mean, what are the potential scenarios if Humphrey's executor actually gets overturned?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Let's explore some of the possibilities. So let's say the court does overturn Humphrey's executor.
Okay, so no more Humphrey's executor.
Right, gone history.
What happens then? What does that world look like?
Well, for one thing, it could mean a lot more turnover at the top of these agencies.
Because the president could just fire whoever they want whenever they want.
Exactly, and that could lead to a lot of instability.
So, like, imagine a new president comes in and they just clean house, fire all the heads of agencies and put in their own people.
Exactly, and those new people might not have the same experience or expertise as the people they're replacing.
And they might be more focused on carrying out the president's political agenda than on doing what's best for the agency or for the country.
Right, so you could see a situation where the EPA suddenly starts rolling back environmental regulations, or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau stops going after predatory lenders.
because the people in charge are more interested in pleasing the president than in protecting the public.
Exactly. And that's a pretty scary thought.
It is, yeah. I mean, we're talking about agencies that have a huge impact on people's lives.
Right. And if those agencies become politicized, it could have a ripple effect throughout the entire government.
Okay, so I'm definitely getting a sense of the potential downsides here, but are there any potential upsides to overturning Humphrey's executor?
Well, some people argue that it would make the government more accountable to the people.
How so?
Their argument is that the president is the only person in the government who is elected by the entire country.
Right.
So if the president has more control over the executive branch, it means the government is more directly accountable to the voters.
I see. So it's like a chain of command. The people elect the president appoints the heads of agencies, and those agencies carry out the president's agenda.
That's the idea. And they argue that this would make the government more efficient and more responsive to the will of the people.
Okay, but couldn't you also argue that it would make the government more vulnerable to political whims?
Definitely, that's the other side of the coin. If the president has too much power, it could lead to a situation where the government is constantly changing course, depending on who's in office.
So instead of having a long-term vision for the country, you just have a series of short-term political maneuvers.
Right, and that could be very disruptive and destabilizing.
Okay, so it sounds like there are some pretty strong arguments on both sides of this issue.
There are, and it's a debate that's been going on for a long time,
And it's a debate that's likely to continue for a long time to come.
especially with these cases working their way through the courts.
Exactly. So it's important to stay informed and to keep an eye on how this all plays out.
Absolutely, because it could have a huge impact on the future of our country.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have, yeah, we've gone deep.
We have, and I think our listeners have a lot to think about.
I hope so.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive into presidential firing power and the fate of Humphrey's executor.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in as always. We'll keep you updated on this story as it develops, but until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a government that works for all of us.